This is note taker 13 on genetics. So far in the previous two videos on genetics, we've talked a little bit about the structure of DNA and how it was discovered. We've also talked a little bit about the history of genetics. We've talked about Gregor Mendel and his dominant versus recessive, dominant being strong and we represent it with a capital letter, recessive being lowercase and a weaker trait. We've talked about homozygous and heterozygous. Homozygous is when the traits in the pair are the same. Heterozygous means that the two genes in the gene pair are different in some way. Either one is dominant, one is recessive, or they can be represented by two different letters. We've talked about phenotypes and genotypes along with Punnett squares, and then we've discussed sex-linked traits. Today we're going to talk a little bit about some things that are determined by multiple alleles, things like your skin color, hair color, and eye color all work by multiple alleles. That means there's more than just a dominant and a recessive. We're actually going to have more than two letters represent these. The one that you're going to be using in class and the one that you're going to be tested on, we're going to talk a little bit about blood types. Blood types are also determined by multiple alleles. We actually have 3 possible alleles that will make up 4 different types of blood. So your 4 blood types that you could be, you're going to be one of these 4. You could be type A blood, type B blood, type AB blood, or type O. So the chart on this slide shows you in the first column it lists the blood types, and the second column shows you what gene pairs you could possibly have that give you that type of blood. Now, with these, you'll notice there are 3 possible letters that we use. We use an A, a B, and an O to represent these. When we look at the A, the B, and the O, if you look back in your notes at the chart, you'll notice that when the A is with an O, you have type A blood. When the B is with the O, you have type B blood. But then when the A and B are together, you get a mixing and have a type AB blood. Because of these 3 pairings, we know that the A and B genes are actually dominant and will show through. The O gene is actually recessive, so when you pair it with an A or a B, you just have a type A or type B blood. And because both A and B are dominant, when we put the A and B together, we get that incomplete or codominance that we talked about with the flowers and with the horses. Now, with these, you can also do Punnett squares. I know y'all are probably tired of Punnett squares, but not yet. You've still got some more to go. We can actually do Punnett squares using the blood type combinations. So, for example, a mother who is type A blood, but heterozygous type A, so she would have an A and an O, and a father who is type AB. The mother's AO will go across the top of the box, the A in the first column, the O in the second column, and the father's pair, AB, will go down the left side. So the A will be by the first row, and B will be by the second row. Then you'll complete the Punnett square box as shown on the next slide. This would be the completed Punnett square for those 2 parents. I color-coded the letters again so that you could see where the letters for the mom's AO are going and where the letters for dad's AB blood are going. Now, with these, when we look at blood types, unlike some of the other traits we've looked at that have both phenotypes and genotypes, when we talk blood type, there will only be genotypes that we will need percentages for. Because if you remember, a phenotype is something you can physically see. And you cannot look at someone and tell what type of blood they are. You can't just look and go, oh, Miss Ennis is type B. It doesn't work that way. So we're only going to do percentages on the phenotypes, or sorry, on the genotypes. Skin color, hair color, and eye color are all going to work the same way, but there's a second thing that will affect hair color and eye color and skin color, and that's the amount of pigment that you also have. And that will determine whether it's a dark brown versus a light brown, or if your eyes are a dark blue versus a light blue. Now, you carry 2 or more alleles for certain colors, so whichever one is dominant, that's going to show through. And if both of them happen to be dominant, you are going to get the mixing to create that other color. So far, everything we've talked about on Note Taker 11, Note Taker 12, and the beginning of Note Taker 13 is how genetics works in a perfect world. That's the rules of genetics on how it should be working when everything is going right. However, we know that this world is not a perfect world, so we do need to talk about what happens when something goes wrong. So, we call these mutations. And the definition of a mutation is a random change in a gene or a chromosome. If the mutation occurs in a body cell, then that mutation is affecting the organism that has that body cell. However, if the mutation occurs as our body is creating one of our sex cells, an egg or a sperm, the organism won't have that mutation, but the mutation will be passed down to the offspring. Now, there is one thing I need to clear up about a mutation, and we're going to talk on the next couple slides about how mutations can be bad, they can be good, or they can be neutral. Mutation has gotten kind of a negative meaning over the years, but the definition of a mutation is that it's a change. So because it's a change, we can have good changes, we can have bad changes, or we can have neutral changes. Now, if the mutation is harmful or bad, that means it's going to reduce the organism's chance of survival, or it's going to make life harder in some way. So an example of a bad mutation in humans would be sickle cell anemia. In the picture below, you see what the regular red blood cells should look like. They should look like a red, round, almost like the gummy lifesavers that have the dent in the middle of them. However, with sickle cell anemia, the sickle cell mutation actually causes the blood cells to be shaped like little sickles, and sickles were what they used to cut hay down with in the olden days. But you can see that the cells are much differently shaped. The problem with these is that your red blood cell is supposed to be what carries oxygen around your body. The sickle cells are much smaller, so they can't carry as much oxygen, so you tend to get a little bit of bluing color around your fingernails, around your toenails, sometimes around your lips. It can also cause people to have problems breathing if they're put in a situation where they're struggling for that oxygen. The boys may notice this, or if there are any sports fan girls out there, you may notice this. But if you've ever watched a game, a football game, that is occurring in Denver, Denver's stadium is much higher than sea levels. And as you go up in the atmosphere, as you go higher up, the percentage of oxygen decreases. So a lot of times when the football players come off of the field, you'll see them sit off to the side and they'll actually have oxygen masks on to help them breathe. Well, people who have sickle cell anemia that are football players usually can't even play in those games, because if a regular person with regular red blood cells needs oxygen, then it would definitely be too much of a situation for somebody with sickle cell anemia to get into. So a lot of times they will just go, they'll sit on the sidelines, or sometimes they won't even travel with the team to those locations. Other mutations that you get may be helpful. An example would be the Katahdin potato, and there's a picture of the potato below. This mutation that occurred, and it just occurred randomly, actually made the potato resistant to disease. And another nice side effect of it was that it also made the potato look and taste better longer than, like it had a longer shelf life than other potatoes. Well, this was a good mutation. The resistance to disease made it be able to survive better over farmers' crops. Like if a disease hit the farm, these potatoes were able to survive where it wiped out all the others. So this is a mutation that farmers wanted to have in their potatoes. So as these potatoes grew, they would actually breed these potatoes back to other plants to try to make other things resistant to disease, so that we'd have more production of crops means more money in the farmer's pocket. Now, the third thing with mutations is they can be neutral. These are going to be mutations that don't hurt or don't help the organism. In class, we talked about if two people with no freckles, which is recessive, can have a child with freckles. The answer is normally, if genetics is working properly, no, they can't. But we do know that there are freckleless parents out there that do have kids with freckles. This is because of mutations. And this would be one that's neutral. It doesn't help you if you have freckles, but it also doesn't hurt you having freckles. Now that we've seen that some mutations can be good, some bad, some neutral, we need to talk about how mutations actually happen. DNA is just a bunch of chemicals stuck together by chemical bonds, and you're going to learn more about chemical bonds in 8th grade. Now, chemical bonds are easily broken, so it's not a far-fetched idea that pieces of DNA can actually break off. So, let's look at the 3 ways mutations can happen. First way is that a part of a chromosome, so a section of DNA, breaks off and is separated from all the other chromosomes, and it's just kind of lost in the nucleus. The second way a mutation can happen is that a part of a chromosome can break off, flip around, and then reattach. So it actually reattaches on backwards. The third way is that a part can break off of one chromosome and it can get stuck and reattach to a totally different chromosome. In each of these cases, where it is lost, where it flips around, where it reattaches to another chromosome, all of these change the genetic code. So it's going to change the order of the way the A's, the T's, the C's, and G's line up on your DNA strand. If you remember the dog activity, we had the different colored strips to represent the different patterns of the A, T, C's, G's, and depending on where they were on the piece of DNA was what they coded for. Well, that's kind of how mutations happen. When you change that pattern of the way the letters fall on your DNA strand, then you end up with a mutation. Some of the negative mutations or a change in the person's DNA, they can cause what are called genetic disorders. And on the next few slides, I've picked a few disorders just to show you and talk to you about. Some of these are actually caused by a combination of whether or not you got the dominant trait, whether you got the recessive trait, or a combination of traits. Some of them are you got too many chromosomes, you got too few chromosomes, and then others are pieces of DNA changing the genetic code. The first one I'm going to talk about is cystic fibrosis. In this disorder, the body is going to produce abnormally thick mucus. Now, everybody's body already produces mucus, but in cystic fibrosis, that mucus is thicker, and it makes it harder for you to get rid of it. So in people with cystic fibrosis, that mucus actually fills up the lung and the breathing passages, and it makes it hard for them to breathe. In the intestines, when you get the buildup of mucus, digestion doesn't happen the right way. With cystic fibrosis, there is no cure. There are medical treatments that people can do to help break up the mucus. However, it's something that you are going to live with and you constantly need treatment for. This disorder is actually carried on a recessive allele, so that means to have this disease or have this disorder, it's not a disease, to have this disorder, you would have to have 2 recessive alleles. Here is a diagram that kind of shows with cystic fibrosis what happens. Each of the organ systems, like it shows your lungs and things like that, and it explains what happens when you have cystic fibrosis. The one on the right actually shows you normal air passages and the air passages at the bottom of someone that has cystic fibrosis, and you can see how that mucus clogs up your breathing passages and you can't get air flowing through there correctly. The next disorder is something that we're going to talk about a little bit in class, especially when we talk about sex-linked traits. This disorder is called hemophilia, and this is called the bleeder's disease. When you are normal, healthy, your blood, when you cut yourself, your blood has platelets in it that rush to the cut, and they clot to each other so that it stops the bleeding. In hemophilia, the person is not making the right amount of platelets. So when they cut themselves, they just keep bleeding and bleeding and bleeding. So even something like a scratch that's deep enough to bleed can be a huge problem for somebody with hemophilia. There is no cure for it. People who have hemophilia usually have to get like medication or type of replacement protein to help their blood clot. This is a recessive sex-linked trait, so it is going to be carried on the X chromosome. So for a girl to have hemophilia, both of her X chromosomes have to have a recessive trait attached to them. For a boy to have hemophilia, a boy only has one X, so if that one X has the recessive gene on it, then he is going to have hemophilia. Here's a diagram that shows kind of how hemophilia works. On the left, at the bottom, you'll see kind of how the normal person works. You cut yourself, you get the little platelets forming, which are those little tan things, and then it stops the bleeding on number 4. But with hemophilia, on the right side of the picture, you don't get as many tan platelets stopping that bleeding, so the injury just keeps bleeding and keeps bleeding, like shown in number 4. Down syndrome is a disorder that you actually get because either your mom or your dad's gene pair fails to separate when we talked about in class the law of segregation that says that your gene pair must separate and one must go to each egg or one must go to each sperm if you're the father. Well, in Down syndrome, the 2 halves of the chromosome, when they're pulled apart in anaphase, don't get pulled apart. So instead of mom sending you one chromosome and dad sending you one chromosome, one parent actually sends you 2 and the other one sends you 1. And when this happens at pair 21, it causes a disorder called Down syndrome. Now with Down syndrome, you're going to have a distinctive physical and mental retardation. To retard means to slow down. So what that means is that you're physically developing and mentally developing more slowly than people your same age. Unfortunately, heart defects are also common with people that have Down syndrome. However, these can be treated. As for Down syndrome, there is no cure for Down syndrome. The picture here on the left shows some characteristics of children who are born with Down syndrome. There are certain physical features that almost everyone with Down syndrome will have. The picture on the right shows what is called a karyotype. It's a picture of your chromosomes. So you'll notice you're supposed to have 46. So at pair 1, you're supposed to have 2. At pair 2, you're supposed to have 2. Actually, all the way to your X and Y at the bottom, or an XX if you're a girl, you should have 2 chromosomes at each pair. However, if you look at the bottom at pair 21, which I've boxed in red, you'll see that instead of 2, there's an extra chromosome there. So that's what's causing the problem of Down syndrome. The last disorder I'm going to talk about is actually one that's a dominant gene. So this one can be kind of rough because if you have it, if you get the dominant gene, it doesn't matter what your other gene is, you're going to have this disorder. And this disorder is called Huntington's disease. This is probably one of the worst you can get because this disorder causes a gradual breakdown of your brain cells. So there is no treatment and it ends in death. This is a completely fatal disorder. There is no cure for this disorder. Actually, what you should notice is that as I've talked about each of these disorders, there's no cure for any of them because these disorders are all genetics. It's in your genes to have these disorders. So there's no way to go into each of your cells and fix your DNA so that you don't have these. So genetic disorders, there are no cures for because it's in your DNA. It's coded for you to have these problems. This last picture here are 2 cross sections of brains from people who have both passed. The top one is the cross section of a healthy brain, and you can see that it's very much filled in. The picture on the bottom right, however, is the brain of somebody who had Huntington's disease, and you can see there's a lot of open areas there where the brain cells have broken down and disintegrated, which led to this person's death. Please don't forget to do the 3-question assessment following the video.